Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. I hope you're doing well. So on this webinar, we will be covering three main pathways in New Zealand migration. This includes post-study and skill, entrepreneur and investment visas, and all with the option of obtaining your PR and citizenship in New Zealand. So our organization, Global Migration Solutions, and in short, GMS, is based in KL. ANZ Migration in Singapore, we are seen as the pioneers in the industry and offer premier migration services. Our programs include New Zealand and Australia, and of course, we also offer programs for Portugal, USA, UK, and Malaysia. So as mentioned, we are seen as a premier migration advisory firm with more than 16 years experience in the industry. We help more than 12,000 families migrate successfully, and now we have 5 offices across Asia Pacific, including Singapore, Australia, Hong Kong, Vietnam, and also Cambodia. So before we start, let me just briefly introduce both our presenters for today, who are licensed immigration advisors for New Zealand and registered migration agent for Australia. Firstly, James Allen Hall, the MD for ANZ Migration. He is a certified professional development trainer for migration agents. As a pioneer in the industry, he has more than 17 years of experience in the migration scene. Before that, he had a corporate career in IT, working as a certified project manager in IBM and handled many clients across many industries. Here you can see he is a licensed immigration advisor in New Zealand and registered migration agent also in Australia. And secondly, is Desmond Ang, our MD for GMS. Recently, he has been awarded the top 50 Global Migration Agencies CEO and has 60 years of experience in the migration industry. Desmond has a strong background in financial and was a certified chartered accountant with PwC before his migration career. Here as well, you can see that he's a licensed migration advisor in New Zealand and also registered migration agent in Australia. Just to make sure, you can also check online to confirm the migration license. Both these experts work closely to support our Malaysia and Singapore offices. And combined, James and Desmond have more than 30 years of experience in the migration scene. And due to their wide knowledge, they are often invited to speak in migration events. So, before I bring on the speakers, just a final reminder, this is the only event that brings together such a combination of experts. So please, this is the opportunity for you during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat box, and we will try our best to cover them when the time permits. And if it doesn't, it does help if you can provide your contact details, then we can get in touch with you after. So without further ado, I will pass on to James.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hazel, and good morning, everyone. Just bear with me. Okay.
James, you have the problems with the remote control, right?
Yeah.
Let me just
waiting for the authorization to come through.
Yeah. Seems to move my cursor. Do you mind if I just
Sure.
move slides for you on your behalf?
Sure,
okay.
Thank you.
Do that.
Okay, so look, New Zealand's a fantastic country to live in. My own background, I'm Australian, but I've lived and worked in both Australia and New Zealand. I've done work in Wellington and Auckland, so quite familiar. Now, there are lots of reasons why people choose New Zealand, and you may have seen New Zealand come up in the news a lot over the last year, particularly. The way they've handled the COVID situation has been excellent and got a lot of praise internationally. The safety and security of New Zealand has also been very prominent, especially in these turbulent times around the world. So New Zealand really has become a favored destination for many people around the world, and we are seeing increased demand in people wanting to migrate to New Zealand. So some of the more statistical factors for this are on the screen. So New Zealand has been ranked as the second safest country in the world after Iceland. So in terms of English-speaking countries, it's the safest country in the world. It's very, very high up on the OECD's Better Life Index. And I think I think it's the best English-speaking country that's on that list. And normally it's New Zealand up there with like Finland, Norway, Sweden, these countries that have very high quality of life. Permanent residency in New Zealand, very interesting thing. So if you go to, let's say, Singapore or Australia, or even US, and you get your permanent residency, it's not truly permanent in every way. And there are ongoing requirements that have to be met every few years. But in New Zealand, when you get your permanent residency, you have it for the rest of your life. It's almost like a citizenship in that sense. So it means you've got no further obligations and you can travel to New Zealand at any time in the future. So you get your PR now, you can go to Malaysia or Singapore or anywhere else and work for the next 10, 20, 30 years if you wanted, and still be able to go back to New Zealand at any time. So fantastic option there. And the education system, very highly ranked globally, it's world-class. And healthcare as well. Healthcare also rates very, very highly in the world. And it's because New Zealand has a very strong subsidized healthcare system by the government that basically gives you free hospital care and covers all of your significant medical costs. So a very, very strong healthcare system.
You can try to take over the remote control, James.
Okay, we'll see how we go. Okay, a couple of other factors. Now, I'm based in Singapore, so things like ease of doing business are very significant when it comes to Singapore. However, Singapore's been overtaken by New Zealand. So in the last few years, New Zealand's become #1 in the world for ease of doing business. I think Singapore is now #2. It's 3rd on the index of economic freedom and #1 for transparency. So this is lack of corruption. It is now #1. I think Singapore is #2 on this. So #1 in many aspects that are significant for doing business and business activities in the country. So we're going to talk about various pathways today. This is a summary of the different pathways we'll talk about. So we'll talk a bit about skilled migration, which is for working professionals and people with good qualifications and experience. We'll talk about the entrepreneurial pathway, which is for people that want to get into running a business, but don't necessarily have any significant business history and want to go down to New Zealand to buy or start a business. And we'll also talk about the investment categories, which allow people to migrate to New Zealand based upon doing investments in New Zealand. There are also pathways based upon employment. We won't talk a lot about those today because they are quite complex, but there are basically options to go to New Zealand if you're able to get a job offer in New Zealand and there's a company there that's willing to support you. Then there are pathways you can use under various work visas to actually get your residency in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand, as I mentioned before, has permanent residence. So it's a little bit confusing, so bear with me. So New Zealand has what we call residence, first of all. And actually outside of these two, there are still temporary visas. So temporary visas basically are for you to go to New Zealand for a short period, let's say on a temporary work visa, and work for a while. But in addition to that, we have residence and permanent residence. Now, residence, very simply, is like permanent residence, but it has a fixed duration, so it doesn't go on forever. But you get most of those permanent residency benefits. So you get the free education in public schools, you get local rates at university, you get the healthcare support, you get social welfare support, and so on. So you get all of these various benefits, but your visa has an expiry. The next step up, and where people want to move to, is the permanent residence, because you get all those residence benefits, but your residence has no expiry. So it's permanently there for the rest of your life. As I mentioned before, you can travel to New Zealand at any time in the future, no ongoing requirements. You've got your position secured for life in New Zealand, and that's you and your family as well. And if you are looking at citizenship in New Zealand, which a lot of people are, now you don't have to go with citizenship. That's worth keeping in mind, especially coming from countries where they don't allow dual citizenship. You get the permanent residency. It's as good as citizenship. The big difference is you're not going to get the passport from New Zealand. That's the big difference. So you want to get that passport and have the access to countries that the New Zealand passport will give you. And that will also give you access, by the way, to live and work in Australia. So you get your citizenship in New Zealand. You can not only live in New Zealand, you can also live and work openly in Australia as well. So that's a fantastic benefit and reason to move to citizenship. So if you want to get to citizenship, you need to be in New Zealand for at least 5 years, and you can have some gaps in that. You can up to at least 12 months away, roughly, over that 5-year period. So basically, you need to physically be in New Zealand for at least 4 out of the 5 years to qualify for citizenship. And you've got to express an intention to continue on living in New Zealand. You don't have to, but you need to express that intent when you actually apply for this visa. Oh, sorry, citizenship, I should say. Okay, Desmond, you're going to take us through the skilled migration, I believe.
James, I will cover the last two parts.
Okay. Sure. Okay, so let me talk about skilled migration. Now, skilled migration, one of the key aspects of skilled migration is a point system where you get points for different factors. So there are points given for things like your age, your qualifications, your work experience, and so on. And then we add up these points. And these points are really used as the main selection criteria to decide whether or not you're able to apply for a skilled visa to go to New Zealand. Now, years ago when you did this, and I'm saying maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it wasn't so difficult to get through this process, but with recent changes, generally to get through skilled migration, you need to have yourself and a partner with very high qualifications. And we're talking with you both at least a bachelor degree and one of you at least at the master's level, or a job offer in New Zealand. So if you're a single applicant without a job offer, or you're a couple, but you only have bachelor degrees, then it's very unlikely you'll be able to be eligible under the skilled point system. And that's simply because you won't get enough points to make it a viable pathway for you. But you can see some of the main areas of getting points on the screen. Previously, 160 points has been required to be selected under the skilled points test. I say recently or historically because currently the skilled migration program is on hold due to the COVID impact. We do expect this to start resuming soon, but at the moment they're only processing applicants that are living in New Zealand. So you can see the points on the screen. Something I want to mention, just be aware that when we talk about qualifications, New Zealand uses a scale of 1 to 10 for qualifications, 10 being the highest at a PhD level, 7 is your bachelor, 9 is a master's degree. So 8 is a low-level master's or a bachelor with honors. So you'll see that come up a lot, and that's used as a reference point for when you are dealing with qualifications. Okay, just to move on. So one of the reasons that people do skilled migration, as I said before, is, it's a pathway to residence, and it doesn't always require a job, but in practical terms, these days, for most people, you will need to have a job offer to get that residency under skilled migration. Now, it's a challenge. If you're living overseas, the bottom line is most employers in New Zealand aren't going to consider you. There's people down there in New Zealand already. It's a lot easier for them to meet up with them. They're going to have familiarity with the New Zealand environment. Starting the job is going to be a lot easier because they're already down there, and it's just a lot easier. So employers will generally not give job offers to people that are applying from overseas. There will be exceptions, especially for those that have very strong skills that are in shortage in New Zealand. And some industries can be easier than others. But on the whole, it's a lot easier to actually get that job offer if you're already down in New Zealand. And one of the strategies we employ for this is using study as a way to get down to New Zealand. Now, so there are some great benefits with doing study in New Zealand. And one of them is that New Zealand will give an open work visa. So that's a work visa without any limitations, provided you've studied in New Zealand for at least 30 weeks and completed the qualification. So 30 weeks is just over 6 months. So we're saying basically a 1-year qualification. So if you complete a 1-year qualification, you can get a open work visa to live and work in New Zealand without restriction. And that's typically at least 2 years. It can be longer in some cases. That's the step one you see on the screen. Now, if you are studying a bachelor degree that is in a high demand occupation field, or you're studying a higher qualification like a master's or PhD, then your spouse will also get full-time work rights. Now, why that's significant? You could still be studying, your spouse or vice versa, but the person on the work visa could then qualify for skilled migration even before that study is finished by getting a job offer in New Zealand. And they've got those full-time work rights. So they're already down there, they're familiar with the environment, they're able to go and meet up with employers, and they've got open work rights. So there's nothing holding them back from getting that job offer. And we'd have to look at each case separately, but generally speaking, if you get a job offer in New Zealand, for most people, you're going to be eligible to go through to skilled migration. And that's on the bottom part of the slide here. The backup option, and in immigration, it's always good to have backup options because things can change. So to have multiple levels and have backup options is one of our important considerations when we're developing a migration strategy. The backup strategy here is if you, and it may also apply to someone who's single, is that after you've done the study in New Zealand and you've completed that 1 year, as I mentioned, you can get a post-study work visa. And that's an open work visa that is eligible to you after you have completed your qualification. And that will then let you go and follow up with employers, do job interviews, start work and so on. And again, once you've got that job offer, you can then apply for skilled migration. So there are two options here. For those who've got a partner, you've got additional options that your partner could qualify for the skilled migration. If you're single, then you would look at finishing your qualification first and then going on to the open work visa. Now, to give you an idea of what the costs are for studying in New Zealand, because that's obviously an important consideration, you're typically looking around 10 to 20K for like a certificate or diploma level course. You're looking at around 20 to 30K as an approximate estimate for a bachelor degree or master's. And for a PhD, now this is very, very important. For a PhD, you are paying local New Zealand fees. You're paying what a New Zealander would pay when they are studying a PhD in Australia. I apologize for the noises, but I've got toddlers and they are trying to join in with the session, so I do apologize for that. So for PhD, you're paying what a local would pay. Now, if you went and studied a PhD in Australia, you could easily pay 100,000 or more for a PhD qualification because you're paying international student fees. But in New Zealand, you are paying the local domestic fees that a local New Zealander would pay for a PhD. So this is worth considering. It's a very, very good option. Now, the other thing I also want to mention while we're on this, certificate and diploma level courses. Now, coming from an Asian environment, and I've been in Singapore since 2000, we know that there's a lot of status in New Zealand, in Singapore and in Asia generally. And what I mean by that is, if you're working as a doctor or a lawyer, it's seen as a lot more prestigious as an occupation versus working as a plumber or electrician. But in New Zealand, we don't have that distinction. There is nothing at all wrong, and you're not looked down upon if you're working as an electrician or plumber in New Zealand. And you can, let's say you're running your own plumbing business, you can earn as much as a doctor very, very easily. And it's not looked down upon. And this is one of the great things I think about living in New Zealand is that if you've got children and the children aren't academically inclined, so they're not the type that will get A in maths and science, but they're more hands-on. They have options where they can go and study a diploma course or a certificate course to be an electrician or a plumber or a carpenter and earn fantastic salary. And they can support their family, they can buy a house, but you'd have difficulty getting financial security in those kinds of options, those occupations in Asia. That's the reality. So I think this is fantastic. And if you're inclined for those sorts of trades courses, there are fantastic options there for you, and you can earn very, very good salaries. Okay, in terms of the process for the skilled migrant category, the system works around what we call an expression of interest. So expression of interest is where you give information to the New Zealand government that goes into a database and it sits there. You're not providing any evidence yet, but you're providing information on your circumstances, which will be for a points claim. So you're saying, I think I'm entitled to these many points because of these claims, basically, these qualifications, this work experience, and this background information. The government will then periodically select people out of that database, and they'll give them an invitation to apply for the visa based upon the points. And that's where you need to go and substantiate all the claims that you made. So if you've said, for example, I've got 5 years work experience as a project manager, you'll need to provide evidence of those 5 years of experience. Now, you'll go through that and you'll prove all your claims, and if everything's okay, what will happen? Now, two things here. If you've got a job offer already, you'll go straight to the residence visa. If you don't have a job offer in New Zealand, then you'll get what's called a job search visa. And the government will put your skilled visa on hold for 12 months. And in that 12-month period, they will allow you to have an open work visa called a job search visa that will let you go down to New Zealand and look for work because you've got those work rights. And you're required to find a job and be in the job for at least 3 months. So after 3 months employment, you can then apply for your residence visa. Remember, I said that if you've got a job offer, you skip this and you'll go straight to the residence visa. So for those that don't have a job offer, you get your 3 months employment and then you can apply for the residence visa. Now, a few things to be aware of, and we see a lot of mistakes being made, and we get applicants that come to us because they've had problems, they've tried to do it themselves, and they've had mistakes. Now, there's a lot of very, very important terms that are used. For example, when we say skilled employment versus employment, skilled means that there are certain requirements that have to be met. That includes entry requirements for an occupation. So again, if I say that I've been working as a project manager for 5 years, but I don't have the entry requirements before those 5 years, for example, I don't have a bachelor degree in IT, or I don't have sufficient work experience before the 5-year period to qualify, then that work experience can't be considered because I haven't met what we call the skill level requirements to be qualified to be able to do that work experience. So even though I may have done 5 years of work experience, if I didn't meet the entry requirements that New Zealand set for that, you can't count my 5 years of work experience. Also, when it comes to work experience, there are limitations about similar or comparable labour market. So in New Zealand, they look ideally for work experience that's in countries where the labour system, the employment market is very similar. It will make that transition to the New Zealand environment easier. Now, there are some exceptions for this, and there are exceptions made if you're coming from a country that doesn't have a comparable labour market, but the occupation is in high demand in New Zealand, or you're working for a multinational company, then there are exceptions being made for that work experience. Qualifications, also very, very important. When you're applying for skilled migration, I mentioned in the point system, there are points for different qualifications. Now, those points are awarded only if the qualification is recognised. So there is a list of qualifications that have already been checked by Immigration New Zealand, and they've said, okay, we recognise these qualifications. So there's a list of universities and qualifications they'll recognise. If your qualification is not on those lists, then you must go through a formal assessment process before you can use or claim points for that qualification. And that assessment process is by an authority in New Zealand, and it will determine what your qualification is equivalent to in the New Zealand system. So you can't assume that a bachelor degree from your home country is equivalent to a bachelor degree in New Zealand. For example, a country like Philippines, where there's a wide range of universities, the quality level of these universities differ. For example, a qualification from De La Salle University, probably from any campus in Philippines, is going to be well recognized because very high quality. But other universities that have multiple campuses, the quality will vary, and we may see some qualifications come out as maybe a slightly lower level, maybe an associate degree or an advanced diploma, rather than a bachelor degree, even though the certificate says bachelor degree. So this is a very, very important consideration. And this must be done before you put your expression of interest in. So be aware of that. If you haven't done it for the expression of interest, then your selection will be invalid later. But you won't know that until you try and apply for the visa and they come back and reject your application. Okay, Desmond, you're going to talk about the New Zealand entrepreneur.
Sure. Right, thanks, James, for the great sharing. Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Desmond. So I'm going to walk everybody through this New Zealand entrepreneur category. If you're open to run a business in New Zealand for a minimum of 2 years, do explore this option for your New Zealand residency. Yeah, first of all, this is a very interesting pathway. It does not need you to already be a business owner like what Australia require. Yeah, for those who is familiar with Australia, and there are requirements such as require you to be already a business owner, holding certain percentage of share, having certain number of the turnover fulfilled before you can even apply for that visa. And under New Zealand entrepreneur category, the pathway doesn't require you to already meet those criteria. Yeah. However, do not think that this is an easy program, although the requirement seems to be easy. Let's look at the important aspect of this pathway. First of all, the acceptable business, idea. So what is an acceptable business in this case? You can't generally run a grocery store. You can't run a 7-Eleven, for example. The business has to be in line with either one of the acceptable business. In this case, it is either an export-based business or a technology or a high growth. Now, talking about high growth, let me give you an example. If you open up a restaurant, this is generally not acceptable. But if you're opening up a restaurant and expand it into a franchise base, so this is considered as a high growth. Okay. Now, also the minimum investment amount. I'm sure many of you out there is excited to see that it is just a minimum of 100,000, but many viable business is going to need more than just 100,000. Yeah, as part of the application process, we are required to provide the profit and loss and cash flow forecast. And we find that most of the acceptable plans by the New Zealand government or the immigration is ranging from 300,000 and above. Anything below that, it is very difficult to match, an acceptable business plan. Yeah. Also, here is a point system. It ranging from age, how many years of the business or senior management. And as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't necessarily require you to have already a business, but these programs do require you to already be in a senior management role. Yeah. And the amount of the money you are investing, that also takes into consideration as one of the point, factor. Also, where your business is going to be located in New Zealand, whether it is in Auckland or it is outside Auckland. If your business is outside Auckland, then you have additional point, as to claim. So more importantly, I guess, the point when it comes to this point system, what is more important is whether or not those points that you are claiming, which is realistic. And because your residency, in terms of this pathway, will be affected if you claim this point and you are not able to fulfill that and you're not achieving those factors. Yeah. So it is important for you to fulfill every single factor that you have claimed, and that would brings you towards your residency in New Zealand. Okay, now in terms of the process and procedures, now in terms of the process, I mentioned that there is a point system earlier, and you must fulfill the 120 points, first of all, and you need to have a business plan. Again, I need to emphasize how critical the business plan is. one of the common mistakes that we have seen over the time is some of the applicants out there focus on dressing up the business plan. And that is very difficult to achieve, even though they get through the initial process. But the problems with this is when they find out later, it is so difficult to achieve whatever that has been proposed, that it is going to be affecting the subsequent process, the subsequent application before they even obtain their residency. So when they have the visa application, the first step upon the approval is to give you the 12 months visa periods for you to get down to New Zealand, set up a company, and transfer your investment fund over towards running your business. And following that, you can apply for the entrepreneurial work visa, which is 24 months. And that 24 months, this is very crucial because you are expected to run your business according to what has been proposed and has been approved. Yeah. And this is going to be evaluated at the end of the 24 months in terms of whether or not you are getting through the residence visa successfully. Okay. Now, during the 24 months, there is a fast track process. If you can cut short the 24 months to 6 months, if you are investing minimum of 500,000 or more and employing 3 full-time staff. And in 6 months' time, you can move on to the step 6, which is your residence visa quickly before the 24 months is ended. But that doesn't mean that your business plan that has been proposed and approved will be superseded by increasing your investment amount and employing 3 staff. In the 6 months' time, the government is still going to evaluate at the end of the 6 months to see if you carry out your business according to what was being proposed in terms of the turnover that you have proposed, by pro rata, whether or not that achieve the amount of the investment that you have proposed earlier. Should that be not more than 500,000, but now have you invested for 500,000? So the three employment staff, full-time employment staff, are they a residents or are they a citizens? So all these are going to be evaluated at the end of the 6 months. And then move on to the 24 months of the residency visa. And James earlier had explained, how to move on from the residence to permanent residency visa. So this in general is applicable if you are open to run a business for a minimum of 2 years in New Zealand. And do contact us if you do have these plans, and let us guide you through in terms of the timing, in terms of what is so important over how to propose a realistic business plan that would help you move through the process smoothly. Okay, I'm going to go through walk you through to the next pathway, which is the New Zealand investor category. Now, this is one of the popular pathway that we have dealt with for New Zealand. It does require a significant amount of fund, but it is actually a very good program. New Zealand has one of the highest regulated programs as compared to many others in the world. Now, we have done Australia investment programs, we have done Portugal, we have also done the United States EB5 programs. But reason why I mentioned that it is highly regulated, because you're putting in the application and it is going to be assessed first of all before you are required to invest. So unlike some of the programs out there, you're required to put in the investment amount, then only you're allowed to put in your visa application, whereas the New Zealand work the other way around. Now, there are 2 streams under this pathway. Basically, you can go for a higher investment for a reduced requirements, or a lower investment, but you have to meet a few more requirements. Yeah. Now, the first one that I'm going to walk you through is the investor ones, which require you to invest 10 million New Zealand dollar. Yeah. Most of the requirement is being waived under this category or this stream, but you still need to fulfill some of the basic requirements, such as the healthcare, health checks, or for example, health check, making sure that, all of the family member in your application would need to pass, the minimum health check. And other than that, there's also criminal records checks that you have to fulfill. And all you need to do is to commit to maintain your investment of 10 million over the 3 years periods. Now you can move your investment around during the 3 years periods. When you see there's an opportunity on other investment options, you can exit from your existing investment and move your fund into a new investment during that 3 years periods. And we are going to look into what are the acceptable investment shortly. Now, under this pathway, all you need to spend is just a very minimum of 88 days over the 3 years periods. Yeah. Now, let's look into these Investor 2 programs. And it is so surprised to see such a surge in the Investor 2 programs, even though during the pandemic periods. Now, these programs require to invest 3 million New Zealand dollar over a period of 4 years. And I will also talk about, a reduced options to 2.5 million instead. Yeah, it has an additional requirements. You need to be below 65 years old, whereas the Investor 2 doesn't have an age limit. Yeah, and you need to score a point of 20 points. Now, this 20 point is very easy to fulfill. And for anybody who is looking at this pathway, do contact us and I will walk you through the points. Under these programs, in general, you need to spend a little bit more time as compared to the first options. There is a 438 days that you need to spend in New Zealand over a period of 4 years. And as I said, as I mentioned earlier, this has become so popular, and there's a surge of this application. In fact, these options of Investor 2 visa, it was being frozen for a while during the pandemic periods, and these options has just opened 2 months ago, and the invitation is ongoing now. And let's look into the next slide, which is the acceptable investment options. Now, there are a variety of the investment as compared to Australia. First of all, if you look at Australia, in general, you're investing all into the government bond, or you're investing into the private equity under the higher investment options. Whereas for New Zealand, you can generally choose, if you are risk adverse, you could choose to invest into the bond, which cover government bond, which cover bond that is issued by the registered bank. Yeah, and a lot of you out there who is looking at protecting your capital or your principal, and this would be a suitable options for you. And there are people who is also looking at investing into the property, and you can choose to invest into a new developed private residence or commercial property. Yeah, so this is not applicable if you go under the Australian investment programs. Yeah. Now, you could also choose, if you're open for higher risk and higher returns, you could explore, the managed funds, the private equity. You could also choose to invest into some of the, charity organizations. Yeah. Last but not the least, you could also use some of the money towards the business and running a business. Now, talking about the discount of 500,000, if you choose to invest half of your money into the high growth investment options. Now, under the high growth, anything that you have seen over here, except bonds, is considered as high growth. And instead of investing 3 million for Investor 2 category, all you need to invest is just the 2.5 million. So that gives you some idea on the options, the mix of the investment that you can choose, their variety over here. You generally, as I mentioned, you generally do not need to invest until your visa has been submitted and approved. So you're talking about over a period of 6 months to 12 months before you are being asked to invest. And when you are being asked to invest, how long do you have to complete the investment? Yeah, you have another 12 months. Yeah, so you do have 12 months before you need to complete your investments. And when you completed your investment, you are moving directly into a residence status, a residence visa. So that says all benefits start immediately after you have completed your investment. For those who choose to complete the investment earlier, so your residence status starts immediately after that. Okay. Now I hope that that gives you, all of you, some idea. Started from James, that talks about the skill migration, and then we move on to speak about the New Zealand entrepreneur visa and the investment visa. And I hope that that gives all of you some idea on what could be the suitable pathway for you and your family member. Okay, and there are a lot more. Of course, James, we just can't cover the two detail over here because of the time limitation. And I guess we pass over to you, Hazel, for question that's posted to us.
All right. Thank you so much again, Desmond and James, for that wonderful session. So here I do see that quite a number of questions. So we will try to cover as much as possible, but hopefully we can just keep it to 10 minutes and see how much we can cover. So just starting off the first one, this first person's asking, can I start my own business after I study? Maybe James, you can cover this?
Sure. And the quick answer is yes. I mean, I talked about after the study, you can get an open work visa. And so when I say open, it means fully open. There's no restrictions around the employment you're going to do. So if you want to run your own business, you can do so. If you want to take a regular job, you can do so. Now, if you are going to use a business and use the business to qualify, so your job in your own business to qualify for skilled migration, it is technically possible. However, you will have to show that the business is viable, is running, because one of the requirements for the job for skilled migration eligibility is that the position is likely to be ongoing. So you will have to show that the business is viable and it's reliable and it's secure. Basically, the job is secure. So that they are factors that will be taken into account for that, if you're going to use it for that. But the short answer, as I said, is yes. You can run your own business under that open work visa.
All right. Okay, on the next one, how does New Zealand compare to Australia in all the pathways you presented today?
Yeah, and I guess I'll answer that because I've lived and worked in both countries, so I've got a very good first-hand experience there. Look, I feel a bit guilty saying this as an Australian, but I actually prefer doing New Zealand immigration because the New Zealand government is fantastic to deal with. If I need to speak to an immigration officer about a case, I can just call them up and speak to them. I can't do that in Australia. And New Zealand actually, they thank me for talking to them. And it's so different. And again, I'm going to feel very guilty saying this, but I say to people that it's very true. And because I'm Australian saying this, it's true, that New Zealand is like Australia, but just a little bit better. So, and that I really do think that New Zealand is very, very similar to Australia, but it's a little bit better in most regards. It's more progressive. It's got a lot better achievements than Australia. The government, I think, is a lot better than Australia. But specifically in the visa pathways, your benefits and your flexibility generally is much better in New Zealand. The processing times are much better in New Zealand. The thing that is probably not as good is the investment amounts are generally higher in New Zealand than Australia. But when you talk about investments, the flexibility, the investment options, the returns, all of these are far better than what you get on the Australian side. So, generally, I would say things are better in New Zealand. I guess one more thing I'll mention in terms of the visa differences, if you're doing skilled migration, Australia has got a lot of emphasis on English language ability. And to get the maximum points for English language in Australia, under the IELTS test, as an example, IELTS is graded from 0 to 9. To get the maximum points in Australia, you need an IELTS of 8. And it's not just average of 8, it's a minimum of 8, the 4 sections of reading, writing, listening, speaking. That's 8 out of 9, almost a perfect score. With New Zealand for skilled migration, the English requirement, the maximum and minimum, it's just the same, is 6.5 average. So 6.5 out of 9 as an average score. So a lot more flexibility and generosity there when it comes to English language competence.
All right. Thank you so much, James, for laying out both the pros and also the cons. So the next one, how do I find a job in New Zealand? Desmond, would you be able to cover this?
Sure. Well, finding a job in New Zealand, well, for those who had already tried looking for a job in New Zealand, I'm sure most of you might experience the same, might go through the same experience, yeah, might have the same experience. You might be asked whether or not you have a visa with the work rights. I think the first steps. So this is the question. Now, so that says, the government, the immigration policy for both Australia and New Zealand is meant to protect the PR and the PR or residents or citizens. So the job priority is given to those who is a PR or residents or a citizens. So I would say getting a job, first of all, you need to get yourself ready, to have a visa with the work rights, and get most of you, for those who is professional, get yourself explore the skill migration. If you don't meet the requirements, look at the options of going to study. The post study pathway would generally increase your chances of going through the skill migration successfully. And and once you have the job ready, the visa ready, and if should your jobs comes under one of the long-term skill shortage lists, if you're engineer, you're IT professional, or you are the health professional, health-related professional, you don't have much issue or don't have too much of challenge in terms of getting the jobs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Desmond. And the next one, do my kids get to also study for free there? Desmond, maybe you can cover this?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you already got a residence visa, yes, basically when you are a resident and your kids study for free under the primary and secondary school, if it is a tertiary education, you're basically paying the same fee as what a local or a local citizen would pay. Now, that is provided if you are holding a residence status. Now, if you remember what James has mentioned earlier, the post-study, the study pathway to the residence, if you are going, if one of you, between a husband and wife, if one of you were to study at the bachelor degree level and above, and your spouse would generally entitle to the work visa options. And when your spouse entitled to a work visa options, then with the work visa that your spouse has or holding, then your child is considered as a domestic student. Now, the difference over here is the child doesn't entitle to study for free if the father or the mother is holding a student's visa. But the child is entitled to the domestic student's fee if one of the father or mother is holding a work visa. Okay, yeah, so that option is so important. And as James has mentioned, in fact, by one of you going to study, but of course, we need to advise you to make sure that you study the right programs and the right qualification. So, and by you going to study, your child's education benefit starts almost immediately. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Desmond, for that one. I think the next one could be also suitable for James because it's also covering Australia. If I pursue my PR in New Zealand, what are the opportunities to transfer from New Zealand to Australia after that?
Okay, so I did touch upon this a little bit before. So first of all, if you've got your citizenship in New Zealand, that gives you the right to live and work in Australia. So that citizenship. PR in New Zealand, unfortunately, does not give any access or benefits to Australia. So having a PR in New Zealand is great for New Zealand, but it doesn't give you any benefits, or access rights, or any boost in terms of access or applying for visas for Australia. You're applying just as a local from your home country if you've got the PR in New Zealand and applying for a visa in Australia. So no difference there. It's the citizenship that makes the difference. And that gives you open access to live and work in Australia.
All right. Okay, on the next one, this person is asking, I have 60 points. Am I eligible for skilled migrant?
You want me to up 60 points?
60.
They might be thinking of the Australian system because Australia, the minimum is 65. New Zealand, the minimum has been 160, 160. Now, if you've got 60 points for New Zealand, there's no chance. In fact, at the moment, it's very hard even to get to 160 points, as I said, unless you or your spouse has a master's degree or you've got a job offer in New Zealand. It's very hard to meet that. But I have to point out the 160 was prior to the suspension for the COVID period. We don't know yet whether 160 will be the required level when processing resumes. Hopefully it will, but we don't know just yet. But 60, there's just no chance. You need 160 minimum based upon the historical standard in recent years.
All right. And also for 35 years old, how much does that contribute in terms of points?
35 years gives you 30 points. So the whole category from 20 to 39 years gives you 30 points for your age, which is the maximum you'll get for your age group. So you've got 20 to 39 for that age group, which is fantastic. Gives you a lot of flexibility.
Okay. On the next one, what are the time required that you need to be physically present in New Zealand for various paths? And can we bring our dependent parents with us? Maybe Desmond or James?
I'm happy to. Desmond?
Okay.
Sure, James, you just continue.
Okay. The time required varies. So maybe I'll simplify. Let's talk about the time required on residents to go to permanent residence. So generally, with the exception of the investor visas, which are 3 or 4 year periods, depending upon the investments, generally a residence visa in New Zealand is valid for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, you apply for your permanent residence. Now, the time required in New Zealand, there's a few ways to qualify for the permanent residence, but one of the easiest ways is just spending time in New Zealand, and that would be 6 months per year for the 2 year period. So minimum 1 year in total, but 6 months out of each year physically in New Zealand. Now, you asked about bringing parents.
Yes, that's correct.
There's a few ways to bring parents. There are the parent visas, but these have been changing a lot and are very challenging because there's a high number of people wanting to apply for these. But that is possible. There's a much better way, which is the investor visa for parents, if they can afford to invest $1 million. And that bypasses all of the complications, the long processing time, the queues around the normal parent visa. That's a much better option if you can afford to do it. And it's an investment. It's not a fee, of course. So you can invest the $1 million and get returns from that. That's a much, much better option. But you must be a permanent resident. So you must have finished your resident stage and moved on to permanent residency to be able to sponsor for that pathway.
All right, thank you for that. The next question, this person is asking, I'm a professionally trained chef working close to 7 years now and currently a lead chef for a cooking video production company. Am I eligible as a skilled migrant as I don't have any job offers yet?
Me? Okay. Sure. Most likely no. I'm assuming they don't have very high qualifications. Normally as a chef, you'd have a certificate or diploma level course, or maybe no course before that. So straight off, it's very, very unlikely. You know, even with a job offer, maybe not, because it depends upon the qualification. But study would be a good option there. So you could go on and do a qualification in hospitality or commercial cookery or some other specialization, or maybe you could just do something in food nutrition, you know, something related. And, you know, a chef is a good job to have. A cook or even a chef or pastry chef, any of these areas, food areas, are very, very good jobs to have. So there's good prospects there, but straight off, it's very unlikely you'd be eligible. It's very unlikely you could get to 160 points without the job offer. But study would be worthwhile considering as a pathway to get down there.
All right, thank you so much. And the next one, do you assist on business plan under the Entrepreneurial Residence Visa path? Maybe Desmond, you can cover this?
Sure. Yes, we do. We work very, very closely with the business consultant based in New Zealand. because the business plan, as I mentioned earlier, it has to be realistic, and there's a lot of local research and evidences, that has to be submitted along, with the application. So we work very closely. The objective over here is to make sure that the business is seen as is seen as interesting to the New Zealand immigration, but yet it has to be feasible and realistic when it comes to you running the business and implementing, all the proposal that you have made to the government.
All right. On the next one, I think it's a bit more detailed. My son will graduate in a local university and he is going to further his study in ACCA. May I know, is it better to study PhD in New Zealand to get the visa pathway?
Do you want me to answer? Yeah, okay. So I assume he's studying a bachelor degree at the moment. I assume that's the case.
I guess so.
Look, ACCA, I would say ACCA has got some recognition in Malaysia and Singapore and the UK. I wouldn't say it's got particularly global recognition. I wouldn't, and look, Desmond's an accountant by background, so he can probably comment on that aspect. But I wouldn't say that ACCA would have much weight in, let's say, US, Australia, New Zealand, these countries. It's not typically known. More known there are things like the chartered accounting programs, the certified CPA type programs. So, PhD is an option. Master's degree could also be an option, even a postgraduate diploma, maybe a postgraduate diploma in taxation or finance, something specific to New Zealand. These are all very good options and could and would likely lead to permanent or to residency there, based upon getting a job offer after the study and getting that open work visa after the study. So very, very good options. Anything you want to add to that, Desmond? Sure.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what James has just mentioned. Myself is also, my first tertiary qualification. I completed the ACCA, and I hope, I have that qualification as well. And in Australia or in New Zealand, when you completed, the professional degree like ACCA, you would, in general, you need to carry on with certain years of the work experience and register yourself as a full member, and before it is being recognized. If you're looking at going towards ACCA or going towards the PhD after your son completed your bachelor degree, I would think that PhD would give you a more certain pathway in terms of getting the residency, and in the shorter periods of time as compared to your son moving on to complete the ACCA, because though he might get exemption when he goes on to complete to pursue the ACCA, but there's also comes with like I said, there's also comes with the years of working experience that's needed after he completed the ACCA.
Yeah. All right. Okay, I think that before we end, just a last question. I have a special kid. Will he qualify for a residence visa as well under the entrepreneurial visa?
Are you want me to answer?
Desmond?
Yeah. Well, I mean, both of us answer this question, James, I guess. Well, I think first of all, when we talk about special kids, we really want to know, the scenario and what is the reasons. One thing really nice about New Zealand, the medical request is there's also an option, certain options where you can exclude some of your family member from the application if you choose not to. Yeah, but first of all, I think it is difficult for us to say yes or no by saying that there's a special case. We wanted to see what is the current stakes, what is the development, then what are the supports that's needed before we know whether or not it is impacting the application. Yeah, James, what do you think?
Yeah, look, I agree with you. If you're talking things like autism, there's a huge range. Developmental delays, there's a huge range of things there, and it would depend upon the significance and the degree of support that's required. Because one of the things that's you got to remember in these countries, there are a lot of services that are provided free, medical services, education services, and so the government's got to take into account what the expected cost would be for those services and really weigh them up versus the economic benefits brought in by migration. So they do this in a very fair way. And we can give you a very good idea up front of whether or not it's worth proceeding. So it's not very risky, I would say, in the sense that we can let you know up front whether or not you should go ahead.
Mm.
All
So,
right.
so for example, we have dealt with one case before with a child, with a child of 4 years old with Down syndrome. And that cost was computed as about 1.2 million, throughout his whole life, in terms of the support and the services that is required should the PR be given. So it is not a straightforward process where we have to, we have to seek ministerial intervention and all to get a waiver in terms of the health checks, and that is on the Australia side. But of course, we have to really look into the situation and the scenario of your child in order to be able to advise. Likewise, there are certain countries, certain programs that doesn't require the health requirements. For example, the Portugal programs that we are talking about, or the US EB5. So children, those who is being impacted because of the health issue, they might be able to look into alternative programs, such as the Portugal programs, where, in fact, it is even better where you and your family member have the access to the 27 countries in Europe. And let's talk to us, and, we, open our thought and advise you, and share our thought and advise you.
All right. Thank you so much. So I think this is the only time we have today. So everyone, thank you again for attending. Just to remind you on the screen, if you like a one-to-one consultation or just want to send an inquiry, simply just send us an email, inquiry@globalmigrationsolutions.com, global with a GLOBAL, globalmigrationsolutions.com. Or if you want to send us a WhatsApp, also feel free. But just send us an email. We will get back to you as soon as possible. Or if you need a one-to-one consultation. Anything regarding New Zealand or other pathways, we include study, skill, entrepreneur, business, and also investor. So thank you again, Desmond and James, for this sharing session. Thank you all for attending. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.